Glad to see so many of you here. Thanks very much indeed for joining. This kind of this talk stems from a book I published a couple of years ago, and that book really was in response to a growing sense that I've had that we're missing something in the conservation sector. We think we know what the main causes of decline of our wildlife are. We've all heard about, we know that climate change is serious. We know that the intensification of agriculture, habitat loss, and so forth. But I think there's another major cause of biodiversity loss that most conservationists aren't really aware of, and that's the kind of root of this book. Start with a little bit of local history. I'm assuming you can see a second slide now, can you? A black and white photo?
Yes, we do.
Yeah, okay, great, thanks. A couple of years ago, my wife and I moved up to Scotland, and our local town is this little place called Whithorn, and it's got a very splendid wide street, and this view has been photographed many times over the years, so we can put a time series of photos together and see how this little town has changed. This one, I'm guessing, was taken in about 1890, looking at the style of clothes, and that you can see the view down the main street there. This one taken from the same place, I would date to about 1920, I think. You can see there's a war memorial. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but that white thing there is a war memorial, so it must be after 1918. I'm guessing this is about 1920. And not a lot has changed. The buildings are all the same. We've got electricity now. The electricity pylons have appeared, but really it hasn't changed much since 1890. This, I think, was probably taken about 1960. Again, you can look at every single building and see that every building is exactly the same. Nothing has changed. The same power lines are there. Television aerials have appeared. That's the new kind of thing that's arrived in Whithorn, is television. And then this one here, I know exactly when this was taken because I took it myself last year. And really, the fabric of the town has not changed at all. The buildings are identical. There are no new buildings in there. You could clear the cars out of the way and walk down that street and it would be the same as it was 150 years ago. And that's really the only thing that's changed. In 1890, there were no cars. 1920, I can count 6 cars in that picture. 1960, 20 cars. And 2024, 52 cars. And I was really fascinated when I first started working on this project that there is no word in the English language that describes this process, how the car has invaded our life, how the car has taken over our life, many people would argue. We don't have a word. It's the biggest, one of the biggest societal changes, and I will argue environmental changes of the last 150 years. And we don't have a word for it. And I think this is possibly partly why conservationists and others are not really aware of the problem, because if you haven't got a name for a problem, you can't even start to talk about it. So I had to come up with a name for it, and then the name I selected was Traffication. I couldn't have written this book without this idea of traffication. And I think that there are 3 different dimensions to this process of traffication, all of which have different sorts of impacts on our wildlife. So the first one, and the obvious one, is the increase in the distances we drive, which is a function of how many vehicles there are on the roads and how far we drive in those vehicles. A second dimension has been an increase in speed of those vehicles. And a third dimension has been an increase in the pervasiveness of cars. There are fewer and fewer places now that lack roads. So the car has kind of pervaded, or pretty much in a country like England, for example, pretty much everywhere. So we have these 3 different changes, an increase in traffic volume, an increase in the speed of that traffic, and an increase in the pervasiveness and the extent to which road traffic infiltrates the countryside. So if we look at this is UK figures, but I'm sure these figures would fit pretty much any country. If we look at changes in billion vehicle miles, so this is the amount of driving that we do in the UK, measured in billion vehicle miles between 1950 and 2023. And you'll notice that the y-axis there is actually, it's a proper zero. So it is a directly proportional map. And we currently do about 300 to 350 billion miles in the UK every year. And apart from one obvious dip there in 2020 with the COVID pandemic and lockdowns, the pattern has only ever really been up. And in a human lifetime, the changes have been profound. The change is about 1 or 2% per year. So we don't really kind of notice them in our day-to-day lives. But you go back to the early 60s, when I was born, the amount of driving we do was less than a quarter of what we do now. And even as recently, in my mind anyway, as things like the launch of the first space shuttle and the introduction of mobile phones in the 1980s, the amount of driving we do has doubled in that time. And even in what seemed to us like a summer of calm in 2020 when COVID hit, and we thought, wow, blimey, isn't it nice? There's no traffic on the roads. Over the course of the year, that only really took us back to the traffic levels of the mid-90s. And I don't know why I've picked the launch of the first episode of Friends there as an emblem of the mid-90s, but it just seems kind of quite recent. So the amount of driving that we've done has increased hugely, even if we haven't kind of noticed it on a year-to-year basis. And the amount of driving we do is, I mean, it's literally astronomical. Britain's drivers drive to the sun and back every 4 hours. Every 4 hours. I've estimated that all the world's drivers, in terms of vehicle miles, probably about 15 trillion vehicle miles per year driven around the world. That's 2.5 light years. If we put all the world's cars end to end, they would stretch from the Earth to the moon 15 times. So the amount of driving we do is truly astronomical. This is Halley's Comet, which has a 76-year orbit, I think, a deep space orbit. Our vehicles lap that 5 times every single day. So the amount of driving we do is absolutely astonishing. And the speed at which we travel has also increased hugely. This is the earliest ever production car, the Carl Benz Motorwagen from about 1880. And behind it are the MG races from about 1930. So only 50 years separates them. And the Carl Benz traveled at 7 miles an hour, and those MG races in the background traveled at about 350 miles an hour. So our growth in speed has been huge. This shows the increase in the top speed of kind of average cars. These aren't sports cars. These are kind of average family type cars in the UK between 1891 and 2021. And you can see that even though the highest speed permissible on any road in the UK is 70 miles an hour, you have to go right the way back to the 1950s to find any car that couldn't reach that speed. So we've basically given drivers more and more capacity to drive fast, even though the speed limit is kind of much lower than the top speeds of their vehicles. And then this is one where this is completely hopeless because this would have been an animation and on its own it means nothing. But this is trying to illustrate the pervasiveness of roads in the environment. And what I've done here is I've buffered all the UK's roads by 2 kilometers. So all the areas in black fall within 2 kilometers of a road. And these are only kind of main roads, then it doesn't include little tracks and farms. And you can see that in England, which is kind of the bottom part of that map, pretty much the entire country falls within 2 kilometers of a road. That square on the right there was supposed to illustrate, well, it doesn't matter. You can't see it on this because the animations aren't working. The most obvious and conspicuous impacts of our driving is obviously roadkill. I mean, we kind of see roadkill now almost every time we go out. It's become such a common sight that we barely even notice it anymore. And most of the science of road ecology has kind of focused on roadkill. And there's some quite interesting patterns have emerged. So, for example, the British Trust for Ornithology launched a national survey of roadkill in the UK in 1960. And they showed, this is looking at birds, they showed that roadkill rates peak in May, June, July, August, and fall to much lower levels in the winter. And road ecologists have discovered various patterns like this. Roadkill is not a random event. It's an event that follows certain rules, like most other things. You can predict next week's roadkill in a way that you can't predict next week's lottery numbers, for example. But the biggest problem really is trying to work out what impact that has. And to work out what impact roadkill has on wild populations, we need some sort of estimate of how many animals are being killed on the roads each year. And that's actually incredibly difficult to do. Animals like frogs and toads, they're kind of almost obliterated when they're hit by a car. It's very unlikely that they last on the road for very long. It's known that predators remove roadkill from the road. So if you're estimating roadkill from road transects, you underestimate the number of animals that are being killed. It's known that many animals aren't killed instantly. They're fatally wounded and crawl off to die somewhere else. So they're not recorded on roadkill count. So it's incredibly difficult to actually pin some realistic numbers on how many animals are being killed each year. These are really sort of back of the envelope calculations. So for birds, for example, it's been estimated in the USA that something between 89 and 340 million birds are killed each year. An equally kind of guesstimate from Canada was 14 million birds, Europe 200 million birds, UK 30 million birds. This is really nothing more than educated guesswork. For larger mammals, it's been estimated that about 30 million are killed in Europe and over 1 million in the UK each year. For reptiles, amphibians, reptiles, we've almost no idea. Insects, almost no idea at all. One estimate from Japan suggests that 50 billion insects are killed in road collisions each year. A study from North America, hundreds of billions. And one study from the Netherlands suggests over 1 trillion. So, you can see by the orders of magnitude difference here that we really have no idea how many animals are being killed on the road. But even though it's the most conspicuous illustration of the environmental impacts of the car, I don't think actually it's the most serious. Most of the animals that are found dead on the road are common, widespread animals. Animals that get killed in large numbers on the road share a common characteristic, which is that they are common around that road. And if they are common around roads and can survive in areas around roads, then maybe they're not the worst animals being affected. So I think that for most species, certainly there are some species that are actually threatened by roadkill, but for most species, I think it's more of an animal welfare issue than a conservation issue. And the road ecology fraternity now is kind of moving towards the idea that actually the animals that suffer most are animals that never cross roads at all. If you look at these sort of 16-lane superhighways like this one in Canada, this is a barrier that runs right across the landscape. Almost no animal, or at least no animal without wings, is capable of crossing this barrier. You tend to find that roadkill rates on huge roads like this are actually rather low, simply because almost no animal is stupid enough to set out in the first place to try and cross 16 lanes of traffic. So what this means then is that we've actually kind of cookie cut our landscape into small pieces. We've fragmented it with roads, and it doesn't even need to be big roads like that superhighway in Canada. So research has shown, for example, that many animals like snails, they won't even cross a very narrow road, which means that snail populations have now been fragmented into thousands and thousands of little tarmac walled islands. And we know from island biogeography theory that the inevitable consequence of that is that extinction rates increase, because you're severing once continuous populations into tiny little self-contained populations which are more prone to extinction. And I suspect that a lot of the loss of our wildlife from the wider countryside probably reflects the extinction debt of this fragmentation of our landscape by roads. And there's a huge amount of information which I've summarized in the book to support that theory. But there's a corollary to this as well, which is that while native species are fragmented by roads, they're inhibited by roads. Some invasive species use roads as invasion highways. This is a cane toad which famously invaded Australia from deliberate releases to control insect pests. And the reason it spreads at something like 50 to 100 kilometers a year. Its range is expanding. It's because it follows roads. It's using roads to expand its range into sort of virgin territory. And in Europe, for example, we know that there's a lot of evidence that invasive plants follow roads, like the American ragweed, for example, is following roads and invading the continent through along roadsides. So roads act as barriers to native species and invasion highways to non-native species. But even that, I suspect, is not the biggest impact of road traffic. And here we get onto what was really, to me, the most surprising finding that I came across when I was researching this book, which is the importance of noise. This is a noise map of France, but you could actually navigate. You could use this as a road map, because essentially most of the noise that we experience in our life comes from roads. And this is, this is based on sound recording sensors and so forth, but you could actually use it to navigate your way around the roads of France. And it's the same with every other country. And one of the most surprising things to me in researching this book was just how dangerous noise pollution from traffic is to human health. And almost every week there are new papers being published showing that people who are exposed to high levels of road traffic noise suffer higher rates of cancer, stroke, heart attack, diabetes, dementia, obesity, drug addiction, you name it. I mean, it's a hugely dangerous issue. The World Health Organization estimates that tens of thousands of people die each year because of road traffic noise. And this is because your subconscious mind senses traffic noise as a threat, and it responds by squirting stress hormones like cortisol into your bloodstream, which increase heart rate, increase blood pressure, and over the long term can really absolutely undermine your health. And birds are no different. There was a remarkable study from France looking at house sparrows, and what they found was that the nestlings of house sparrows, so birds that haven't even left the nest yet, they have much shorter telomeres in where they're raised near roads. So telomeres are the caps at the end of your chromosomes that protect your chromosomes when cells divide. And the shorter they are, the more damage is done to the chromosome during cell division. And as you get older, your telomeres shorten and your chromosomes become damaged, and incidences of things like cancer become far more prevalent. But stress also, it's not just age, but stress also shortens telomere length. And what this study found was that the telomeres of nestlings, of house sparrow nestlings raised near roads, were significantly shorter than those of house sparrow nestlings raised away from roads, which means that those birds had already curtailed lifespans before they even left the nest. And incredibly, I haven't been able to find any study looking at telomere length in humans in relation to road traffic noise. So if we know how much noise a road makes, and if we know what level of noise birds start to find that problematic in any way, we can kind of estimate how far from the road these problems spread. So I've got three roads here. The solid black line is a busy road carrying 2,000 cars an hour. The dashed line is a road carrying half that, and the dotted line at the bottom is a road carrying 10% of that. And you can see that the noise is measured in decibels on the vertical axis there, and distance from road. And obviously, as you get further away from the road, so the noise level falls. Now, this kind of assumes that there are no other roads there. Obviously, if you move 1 kilometer away from one road in a country like England, you're probably standing in the middle of another road. But this looks at just a single road. And the lower of those two horizontal lines at 45 decibels shows the level of noise that sensitive bird species start to become affected by noise in terms of showing stress responses or singing differently, or actually just leaving the area completely. And you see that even the quietest of those three roads is producing that level of noise at the distance of 1 kilometer away. And the two busier roads are causing that stress 2 kilometers away. those are the most sensitive species. The average across birds is probably something nearer like 55 decibels, the upper of the two orange lines there. But you can see that even at that, the quietest of those roads is still going to create problems for birds at 250 meters, and the busiest one at nearly a kilometer. And if we assume that the average road disturbs the average bird for the length for about a kilometer away, this is how much of Britain is being affected. I was going to do a similar map for Switzerland, but I'm afraid I didn't have time. So across all the area there covered in shaded in black, birds are being adversely impacted by road traffic noise, we're kind of looking at about 70 or 80% of the country there. And I think that this is probably one of the biggest impacts on wildlife of our driving. It's noise pollution. Now, if you think of other sorts of pollution coming from a car, you probably think of this. You probably think of black smoke belching out of exhaust pipes. In fact, in most countries, that's become much less of a problem now than it used to be because of very tight regulations controlling particulate emissions. What you're seeing there is particulate emissions, not gaseous emissions. And because of very tight regulation, particulate exhaust emissions have come right down in recent years. And I think this is probably a better illustration of the problems facing the problems caused by road traffic in terms of particulate pollution, which is tyre wear, brake pad wear, and the wear of the road, the production of road dust. And we're only really just starting to discover how much of a problem this is. In fact, there was something on the news in the UK this morning suggesting that brake pads are a much bigger human health problem than people thought, because they when you put pressure on the brake pads and the brake pads touch the wheels, they become eroded, and they're giving off a lot of copper, which apparently is very serious problem. But there's all these other toxic chemicals released from brake pad wear and from tire wear, and they kind of react with a whole load of other chemicals in the environment to produce a whole range of new things about which we know almost nothing at all. You can see in the middle there's something called 6-ppd. Now, 6-ppd is in every single tire in the world, more or less. It's put into tires to protect them against ozone. Ozone attacks rubber, and 6-ppd protects tires from ozone. And what it's been found recently is that when 6-ppd is released into the environment, it forms another chemical called 6-ppdq, which is absolutely lethally toxic to certain fish. This is a coho salmon. And coho salmons have been almost eradicated from rivers around the Puget Sound in Northwest Pacific America, because when it rains, tire particles get washed into watercourses, and they contain this chemical called 6-ppdq, and it's absolutely lethal to a range of fish. And we know almost nothing about its toxicity to other animals. We know nothing about its toxicity to ourselves. Once scientists identified 6-ppdq as the agent causing all these fish die-offs, they looked to see what other chemicals were formed by 6-ppd once it was released into the environment from tires, and they found no fewer than 38 of them. And we know nothing about how toxic they are to wildlife. We know nothing about how toxic they are to us. And there's a whole load of other pollutants from road traffic as well, again, which we're only just starting to realize how serious they are. 1/5 of all the world's salt gets dumped on roads each year. And salt, which is the sodium chloride that we use in our food, it is a persistent toxin in the environment. And research has shown now, for example, that some lakes in North America near roads have a salinity almost a quarter that of seawater. And of course, freshwater life cannot survive in those conditions. And then something that we probably know less about than any other impact of road traffic is light pollution. Now, the natural day-night cycle, the natural light-dark cycle is the only constant in the evolution of life. Temperatures have risen and fallen, ocean acidities have changed, the continents have moved around the planet, bumping into each other. But the only thing that's been a constant throughout is the natural cycle of light and dark, which is why many animals and many plants respond to it so so closely, and this natural light dark cycle determines many biological processes. And if we start driving around with headlights on, can kind of completely upsetting that natural light dark balance, and there's all sorts of problems are just starting to become apparent that this might cause. But we're really kind of in the infancy in understanding this problem. Now, when I started my research career in the 1990s, the big game in town in Europe, at least, was the collapse of wider countryside bird populations, what we call farmland bird populations, but kind of the kind of common birds in the countryside. And researchers it seemed like this was the big research game in town in the 1990s. Everybody seemed to be working on this issue, and me too. I was looking at the impacts of agricultural change on skylarks, and we kind of came to the conclusion, yes, it's changes in farming, it's the modernization of farming, it's the intensification of farming that is the problem. That's what's driving the declines of the birds in our countryside. That's the problem we need to address. And graphs like this seem to prove it. So this is the UK Farmland Bird Index. Each dot represents a different year between, I think, 1970 and 2020. And it's plotted here against the cereal yield. And you can see in years when cereal yield was low, bird populations were high. And in years when the cereal yield was high, bird populations were low. And this seems to kind of just prove what we all knew already, that agricultural intensification is the problem. But take a look at this graph. This shows the same farmland bird indicator, but now it's plotted on UK traffic volume in terms of billion vehicle miles. And actually the correlation is stronger. Now, this is only a correlation. It doesn't prove cause and effect, but at least this graph at least is consistent with a theory that a rise in traffic volume has been responsible for the collapse in our farmland bird populations. There are better ways of looking at it. This is going to be a very confusing graph now, because this is where the animations we really needed. But if we just look at the solid black curve, I don't know if you can see my cursor or not, but this line here, what have I done now? This solid black line here represents Britain. The three dotted and dashed lines represent the constituent countries of Britain: England, Scotland, and Wales. But what it shows is what percentage of our land falls within different distances of a road. So if we take this vertical red line here, 1 kilometre, we can take it up to this line here, the line for Britain, and read across. 78% of Britain's land falls within 1 kilometre of a road. And we can go up to the line showing for England here and say that 92% of all of England's land lies less than 1 kilometre from a road. So that's how you can kind of use this graph. But you can read it the other way as well. You can say, okay, within what distance of a road does 72% of our land lie? So you can read across from 72% here to the line for Britain, and you read down, and it's about 750 meters. So 750 meters, 72% of our land falls within 750 meters of a road. And in England alone, you read down from where it intersects the dashed line here, and it's less than 500 meters. And the reason I chose 72% for this example is that's how much of Britain's land is covered by agriculture. And the point here is this: if a road affects birds or reduces wildlife populations for 750 meters either side of that road, then the overall area being affected is exactly the same as the overall area being affected by farmland. And this is quite important. Roads only cover 1% of Britain's land area. And you would think that no matter how bad they are, if they only cover 1% of Britain's land area, then they can't really be anything like as important as farming, which covers 72% of Britain's land area. But what this graph shows is that the effects of roads only have to percolate about 750 meters either side of the road for the area affected to be exactly the same. And this is the most important relationship in conservation that most conservationists don't know about. A very common pattern is that populations of animals are reduced or wiped out altogether close to the road, and then gradually recover until they reach stability at a certain distance away from the road. And this is called the road effect zone. And this has only really been known about for about 20 years, this loss of animals close to roads. And if we can work out what the road effect zone is, then we can calculate how big an area of a particular country is being affected. And there are some reasonable estimates of what the road effect zone is for birds and for other animals too. So some work I was involved in suggested it's about 700 meters in the UK. A study I saw just yesterday from the Netherlands suggests 650 meters, so incredibly close. Another study looking at birds globally, it was a literature review, suggested a road effect zone of about 1 kilometer. For larger mammals, something like 5 kilometers, bats anywhere between 50 meters to 5 kilometers, butterflies over 350 meters, reptiles more than 350 meters. So what that means is that all these animals, their populations are being wiped out or severely reduced within this distance of roads. So if we go back to our calculator, this is the line for farmland. The blue line here is the farmland line. This is the UK birds line, one estimate, 700 meters. So you can see it's about the same. That would be impacting about the same areas that farmland does. This is the global average for birds, about 1 kilometer. So you can see it's affecting a bigger area than farmland is. And right over here, we've got the large mammals, which are being impacted, kilometers away, which means that pretty much the entire country has lost animals because of roads. So this is really strong evidence that even though roads only cover about 1% of our land, they're actually impacting something like 70, 80, 90% of our land in terms of their impacts on wildlife. But there's another kind of corollary to this, which is that some species show the opposite pattern. Some species are found in bigger numbers near roads, and as the distance from the road increases, so their numbers fall until they stabilize somewhere else. This is called an inverted road effect zone. So a minority of species seem to do very well, and it's probably because the road sensitive species have been wiped out, so there's no competition, so they can occur in bigger numbers. Well, that's one possibility. And now here's a really interesting pattern. This is the UK's, this pie chart represents all the UK's breeding species. And it's an incredibly unbalanced avifauna that we have. We have 11 species with populations of more than 2 million pairs, and I've shown those separately here. And then all our 213 other breeding species are in that dark grey segment on the left there. And this is hideously unbalanced. Something like 2/3 of all our individual birds in the UK are from one of 11 species. And if you looked in a more natural, pristine ecosystem, you would see that the species, each segment would be a lot smaller for the species. And what's really interesting here is that the 9 of those 11, the ones with the green pluses in them, they have inverted road effect zones. They are commoner near roads than they are further away from roads, and all their populations increasing. And there's 2 species there, willow warbler and meadow pipit, and they have kind of standard road effect zones. In other words, their numbers are reduced near roads and their populations are declining. And I think this is a really interesting pattern, and it suggests that the entire structure of Britain's avifauna is being dictated by our road network, which is an extraordinary thought. Now, you might be thinking, well, this is all irrelevant because we've got electric cars coming and that will be the end of all these problems. In fact, I think the opposite is true. I suspect that the arrival of electric cars will make things worse. Electric cars are heavier, so they produce more non-exhaust particulate emissions, more tyre wear, more road wear, because they're heavier. They're faster. They are not quieter because most of the noise from a vehicle is rolling noise or aerodynamic noise. Over about 30 miles an hour, electric vehicles are as noisy as combustion vehicles. Roadkill rates, of course, won't change. There's no, these electric cars are just as likely to run over animals as combustion cars. And perhaps the most worrying thing of all is that there's a little bit of information on this, not very much. It suggests that when people transition from combustion cars to electric cars, they start driving more. 600 kilometers a year is a figure I've read a couple of times. People actually start because it's cheaper for them once you've sort of paid the huge cost of the car itself. And maybe people think that, well, I'm electric now, so I'm not doing any damage, so I'll just keep driving. And so what this will translate to is billions more vehicle miles every year and all the problems that that causes. So electric vehicles are not the solution, but there are plenty of solutions. This is Banff National Park in Canada, where this road used to be called the Meat Maker. There was so much roadkill on this road. And in fact, a lot of people were being injured and killed in collisions with big wildlife on this road. So they decided to pioneer a whole new kind of landscape system of crossings. And you can see this is a wildlife bridge ahead of you there. And the idea is that fences along the side of the road funnel animals towards these crossings, and then they safely cross over. So you're simultaneously dealing with the impacts of roadkill and fragmentation here. So this road cuts a kind of a deep wound across the landscape, but these bridges act like sutures, like stitches, binding the wildlife populations on each side together again and helping them to heal. And roadkill rates on this road have fallen to virtually nothing. And there's good evidence that there's genetic flow of animals across these bridges. And there's a whole load of new technology on the way. This is a prototype device that can be fitted to cars, which collects tire wear particles for safe disposal later, so they're not being sprayed into the environment. And I think maybe because a lot of people don't know what the problem is, a priority would be to sort of inform people. And I thought maybe one way of doing this was during when people are learning to drive, why not include a module on the environment? Here's how you can drive to minimize your impact on the environment. And that would seem to me to be the place to start, because if people don't know there's a problem, then they don't know what to do about it. And if people want to drive in a way that's more helpful to the environment, less damaging to the environment, there's one very simple rule, which is drop your speed. And this is the kind of absolute key message of this entire talk. Most of the damage caused by driving to the environment, to wildlife, to human health increases exponentially with vehicle speed. If you drop your speed from 40 to 30, you might be halving the damage that you do. And that's because of simple physics. An object's kinetic energy is relative to the square of its speed. And I think there's a lot of reasons for embracing the reality that road traffic is a major conservation problem. The cuckoo is one of the UK's most rapidly declining species. And there's been all sorts of theories put forward that it's a loss of insect prey. It's something to do with its migration routes, maybe where it's wintering in Africa, there are problems, drought, fires, whatever it happens to be. But there's been a lot of research published showing that actually cuckoos are incredibly sensitive to road traffic noise. And there's research from the States showing that another species of cuckoo over there is also incredibly sensitive to traffic noise. And the cuckoo hasn't declined uniformly across the UK. So in parts of England where there is heavy traffic, cuckoo numbers have virtually disappeared. In parts of Britain where there is no traffic, cuckoo numbers have stayed the same or are even increasing. So if we want to look for where the problems facing cuckoos are, they don't lie on the migration routes, I think. They don't lie in Africa. They lie in our road network. And unless we solve this problem, we're not going to get anywhere. And that's it. I've tried to condense an entire book into 40 odd slides with that animation. I don't know how successful it was, but thanks for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Wow. Thank you very much. Loaded question myself I have. So let's go for the translation right away, and then let's get back to few questions that we can accommodate in the time we have. Gabriel.
Yeah, thanks, Samson, and thanks a lot, Paul, for this very boring talk, but very interesting to hear. Je vais faire la traduction en française maintenant. Donc, Paul Donald, il est de BirdLife International, il est basé en Angleterre, et du coup, son travail et sa présentation, c'est sur l'impact du trafic, donc des voitures et des routes sur la vie sauvage. Et aussi mettre en évidence qu'il y a beaucoup de choses qu'on ne connaît pas, et c'est un problème que l'on ignore trop souvent. Donc, Il a commencé par illustrer l'augmentation des voitures au fil du temps, par des photos d'une ville proche de chez lui. Et on voit vraiment l'immense augmentation en termes de nombre de voitures, mais aussi en termes de distance parcourue. Donc, la plupart de sa présentation était focalisée en Angleterre. Donc, les chiffres qu'il a dit étaient pour l'Angleterre. Et les Anglais, maintenant, roulent jusqu'à... c'est quoi le chiffre? Ils font un aller-retour en distance entre la Terre et le Soleil toutes les 4 heures. Et au niveau de la Terre entière, si on collait toutes les voitures les unes aux autres, on arriverait à faire 15 fois la distance de la Terre à la Lune. Donc ces nombres, c'est juste un peu pour illustrer l'immense nombre et impact qu'ont les voitures sur l'environnement. Donc, il a aussi souligné au début de sa présentation qu'il y a en fait très peu, quand il a écrit son livre, il s'est rendu compte qu'il y avait très peu de mots pour décrire cet effet qui est l'augmentation du trafic et ses potentiels impacts sur la biodiversité. Donc après, il a un peu structuré sa présentation autour de 3 dimensions que sont la distance parcourue sur les routes ou la distance des routes, la vitesse des véhicules et l'impact en termes de surface qu'ont les routes. Donc, toutes ces 3 dimensions ont vraiment un impact très important sur la biodiversité. Et il a montré du coup qu'il y a aussi une immense augmentation de la vitesse. Et avec l'augmentation de la vitesse, les effets négatifs, autant sur la biodiversité que en termes de collision, mais aussi en termes de pollution et d'autres choses, ça augmente de manière exponentielle avec la vitesse. Il a après plus tard souligné dans sa présentation que c'était très important de réduire sa vitesse si on veut un peu diminuer ces effets négatifs. Il a montré qu'en termes d'impact sur la surface au sol, que si on prend toutes les routes, tout le système, tout le réseau routier en Angleterre, tout le pays se trouve, enfin presque tout le pays se trouve à moins de 2 km d'une route, ce qui est assez impressionnant et assez inquiétant. Après, il a parlé des effets négatifs des routes sur la biodiversité, sur la faune. Donc, il y a évidemment les collisions, les morts par collision, qui sont la chose la plus évidente. C'est ce qu'on voit et qui peut être choquant de voir un animal mort écrasé sur la route. Il a parlé des différences qu'il peut y avoir en termes des saisons et qu'on peut même prédire ce phénomène en fonction peut-être du moment de l'année ou de l'heure. Que les impacts, ils pouvaient aussi être différents entre les différents groupes d'animaux. Les animaux moins mobiles, comme les amphibiens ou les reptiles, etc., ils sont souvent écrasés et meurent, alors que les mammifères, peut-être qu'ils sont blessés et peuvent se déplacer encore un peu plus loin avant de mourir. Les effets des collisions, il est quand même assez important. C'est estimé que chaque année, environ 200 millions d'oiseaux sont morts en Europe à cause de l'effet direct des collisions et environ 30 millions de mammifères. Donc ça, c'est juste au niveau de l'Europe, ce sont des estimations. Donc même si en termes de nombre, ces effets sont immenses, pour la conservation, c'est peut-être moins important parce que c'est surtout des espèces communes. Donc il dit c'est peut-être surtout un effet sur, on peut le voir un peu d'une manière sur le bien-être des animaux qui se font écraser ou blessés par les voitures. Mais il pense que l'effet barrière des routes, qui rend impossible la traversée on va dire, entre deux habitats par beaucoup d'animaux. L'effet barrière des routes est beaucoup plus important parce que ça fragmente vraiment le paysage, ça isole les populations et ça augmente les risques d'extinction, comme il n'y a plus d'échanges entre différentes populations. Alors, les routes ont un effet barrière sur une certaine partie de la faune elles peuvent aussi, et de la flore. Elles peuvent aussi avoir un effet de corridor pour certaines espèces invasives. Là, il a donné l'exemple d'une espèce de crapaud et des plantes, donc des espèces invasives qui utilisent les routes pour avancer dans leur colonisation de nouveaux espaces. Donc, les routes peuvent augmenter l'invasivité de ces espèces. Mais d'après lui, le plus gros impact des routes, de loin, la plus grande menace pour la biodiversité, serait la pollution sonore, donc le bruit du trafic. Il a d'abord montré une carte de la France où on voit la carte de la pollution sonore, elle est quasiment équivalente à la carte du réseau routier. La pollution sonore, du coup, a un effet négatif très fort sur les animaux, mais aussi sur la santé humaine, principalement parce que ça augmente le stress, et il y a plein de problèmes de santé qui découlent d'une augmentation de stress. Il a montré un exemple aussi sur les moineaux domestiques, qui montre que les moineaux qui vivent proches des routes ont des télomères plus courts, et les télomères sont responsables du vieillissement. Donc, si les télomères sont plus courts, on a un vieillissement accéléré. Et le bruit, après, il a montré jusqu'à quelle distance des routes le bruit provoqué par le trafic se propageait, ainsi que les effets négatifs. Et c'est estimé que les effets négatifs sur les oiseaux, ça vont jusqu'à 1 à 2 km des routes, donc les effets simplement dus aux causes du bruit. Donc, presque l'ensemble de l'Angleterre, l'ensemble des oiseaux de l'Angleterre, on va dire, pourrait être impacté négativement par le bruit occasionné par les routes, ce qui est immense. Après, il a aussi parlé de la pollution. Donc, il y a la pollution des gaz d'échappement, évidemment. Une pollution qu'on parle beaucoup moins, c'est la pollution due aux pneus, due à l'abrasion des pneus, et ça relâche des particules toxiques dans l'air. Certaines sont même très toxiques, mais c'est quelque chose qui est très peu étudié. Ensuite, il a parlé de la pollution lumineuse, qui est aussi importante. Quelque chose que j'ai bien aimé, il a mentionné que la lumière, contrairement au climat et à d'autres différentes variables climatiques qui ont fluctué au cours de l'histoire de la Terre, la lumière a toujours été constante, du moins la lumière naturelle, avant l'arrivée de la lumière artificielle, donc la lumière que les hommes produisent. Du coup, énormément d'espèces n'ont pas évolué avec cette lumière. Et du coup, ça a un impact sur plein d'aspects de la biologie d'espèces d'animaux. Ensuite, il a parlé du déclin des oiseaux en milieu agricole, un petit peu en dehors du sujet, parce que c'était quelque chose qui est très documenté. On parle que les oiseaux du milieu agricole déclinent beaucoup à cause de l'intensification de l'agriculture. Lui, il a voulu montrer que on pouvait trouver les mêmes relations, donc les mêmes déclins avec ces espèces en fonction de la pollution sonore, et que par exemple en Angleterre, 70% du pays est couvert par des terres agricoles, mais qu'aussi l'effet des routes sur les oiseaux couvrait aussi environ 70% du territoire, puisque 70% du territoire est situé à moins de 2 km d'une route. Alors que les routes couvrent uniquement que 1 à 2% du territoire, donc elles ont un effet disproportionné par rapport à leur taille. Et beaucoup d'espèces d'oiseaux, du coup, on voit dans leur population qu'elles diminuent drastiquement proche des routes et qu'après une certaine distance, 1 ou 2 km, les populations augmentent. Et pour une minorité d'espèces, c'est l'inverse. Elles sont plus abondantes proches des routes, certainement parce qu'il y a moins de compétition avec les espèces qui sont sensibles aux routes. Du coup, ça montre vraiment que les routes structurent les communautés d'oiseaux et que cet effet est très sous-estimé. Il a vite fait un aparté sur les véhicules électriques, les nouvelles voitures électriques qui ne vont pas régler le sujet parce que, pour diverses raisons, mais d'après lui, elles auront un effet tout aussi négatif que les voitures thermiques. Et à la fin, il a parlé de quelques solutions quand même. Il dit une solution facile, c'est en tout cas pour pallier à l'effet barrière des routes, c'est de faire des passages de faune. Lui, il a montré un exemple au-dessus des routes. C'est aussi possible de faire des tunnels en dessous qui permettent de connecter du coup différents espaces, différents habitats et du coup les populations d'animaux. Il existe aussi des dispositifs pour réduire les particules toxiques des pneus qui sont relâchés dans l'air. Ou sinon, la chose très facile, c'est de moins rouler ou de réduire sa vitesse. Surtout, comme il a rappelé, réduire la vitesse, l'effet négatif entre la vitesse, l'augmentation de la vitesse, pardon, a un effet exponentiel. Du coup, la réduire, c'est aussi un effet exponentiel dans l'autre sens. Il a vite terminé avec l'exemple du coucou, qui est une histoire très connue en Angleterre. Les coucous diminuent. Il y a plein de causes qui sont suggérées, la destruction des habitats, parce que c'est une espèce migratrice. Peut-être que les habitats ne sont plus de bonne qualité en Afrique où ils passent l'hiver. Où ils passent l'hiver. Mais finalement, il a aussi montré que le coucou est une espèce très sensible aux routes et que les populations en Angleterre déclinent plus où il y a plus de routes et que dans les zones où il y a peu de routes, les populations sont plus ou moins stables. Et il a conclu pour dire que tout ce qu'il a montré dans sa présentation, qu'il a résumé très rapidement, est disponible dans un livre qui couvre de manière plus extensive tous ces sujets. Voilà, j'espère que j'ai bien résumé. Et je peux aussi traduire vos questions ou des réponses si nécessaire en français.